In 1966, a woman walked into a London psychiatric hospital claiming she'd been possessed by Christ and Satan simultaneously, and walked out leading a doomsday cult that would eventually shadow Charles Manson himself. Mary Ann MacLean wasn't supposed to start a religion. She was a patient, but after her breakdown at that hospital, something shifted. She emerged with a theology so dark, so meticulously constructed, that it would attract artists, musicians, and the spiritually desperate across 2 continents. By the early 1970s, the Process Church of the Final Judgment had chapters in London, Los Angeles, and Toronto. They wore black robes. They preached that Christ and Satan were equals locked in cosmic war, and they were watching. The story doesn't begin with Mary Ann's breakdown, though. It starts in 1963, when she and her husband Robert Moore were living in a cramped London flat, both of them dabbling in Scientology. They were looking for answers. What they found instead was the machinery of a belief system, so compelling it would consume the next decade of their lives. Scientology gave them structure. Yes, but it also gave them something more dangerous, a framework for understanding the invisible world as a battleground. When the Moores were ejected from Scientology, accounts differ on the details, but they were clearly unwelcome. Mary Ann experienced what she described as a mystical crisis. A breakdown, a possession, or a genuine spiritual awakening. Depending on who you ask, the diagnosis changes, but the outcome was the same. She emerged believing she'd been chosen, that Christ and Satan had both claimed her as a vessel, that she had a mission. By 1966, the Process Church was formally established. The theology was baroque and deliberate. They taught that Jehovah and Lucifer were locked in eternal struggle, and that mankind was caught between them. The goal of the process wasn't salvation in the traditional sense, it was balance, understanding, synthesizing the dual nature of existence. It sounded profound if you were searching for profundity. It sounded like madness if you weren't. The early membership drew from London's artistic underground. Musicians, writers, people who felt alienated by the rational world. The process offered them community, ritual, and the intoxicating sense that they understood something the masses didn't. They published newsletters, they performed rituals, they wore their black robes through the streets of Soho like monks of a secret order, and they grew. By 1968, the process had relocated to the United States. Los Angeles specifically. The timing is crucial. This was the moment when the counterculture was beginning to curdle. The summer of love was over. Manson was already recruiting in the hate. And into this spiritual vacuum stepped the Process Church, offering their own vision of apocalypse, duality, and transcendence. They established a headquarters. They began recruiting aggressively. Here's where the Manson connection emerges, and it's more tangled than most accounts suggest. Process members operated in the same spiritual marketplace as Manson's family. They frequented the same bookstores, the same ashrams, the same desert communes. Some researchers have documented direct contact. What's certain is that both groups were mining the same apocalyptic mythology. Both preached cosmic war. Both attracted the young, the broken, the searching. The Process Church's theology was more sophisticated than Manson's. Messier in some ways. They weren't preaching a simple race war. They were preaching a cosmic reconciliation, that Satan and Christ would eventually merge, that Judgment Day would bring synthesis rather than annihilation. But the psychological mechanism was identical, a special knowledge that only the chosen could access. A world divided between the enlightened and the damned. I've read the surviving newsletters myself. The language is hypnotic, careful. They position themselves as interpreters of hidden truths, guides through a cosmos most people can't perceive, and they do it without the crude violence that defined Manson. That was their advantage. That was also their danger, because a belief system that's sophisticated, that intellectually coherent, can attract people who might otherwise resist simpler delusions. By the early 1970s, the Process Church had chapters in Los Angeles, New Orleans, and Toronto. They ran bookstores, they published magazines, they performed elaborate rituals in rented halls, and they were attracting the attention of law enforcement, journalists, and the emerging anti-cult movement. People were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about what exactly they were doing behind closed doors. The Tate-LaBianca murders in August 1969 sent shockwaves through American spirituality. Suddenly, the counterculture's mysticism looked dangerous. Suddenly, anyone preaching apocalypse and cosmic war looked suspect. The Process Church, despite their theological sophistication, got caught in that wave of fear. They were investigated, members were questioned, their meetings were infiltrated. The connection between the Process Church and Manson was never as direct as some conspiracy theorists claimed. There's no evidence that Manson attended their rituals or that the process directly inspired the murders, but the overlap was real. Both groups existed in the same spiritual ecosystem. Both offered apocalyptic narratives to vulnerable people. Both understood the power of mythology and belonging. What's more interesting than the Manson connection is what happened to the process afterward. They survived the crackdown, they adapted, they moved toward legitimacy. By the 1980s, they were operating animal sanctuaries. By the 1990s, they'd evolved into something resembling a conventional spiritual organization. The robes came off, the apocalyptic rhetoric softened, but the core theology remained intact. Mary Ann MacLean lived until 2007. She never recanted her theology, never admitted it was anything other than divine truth. She'd taken a breakdown in a London hospital and transformed it into a religious movement that lasted over 4 decades. That takes a particular kind of conviction, or a particular kind of pathology, maybe both. The Process Church's legacy is complicated. They never committed murders, they never orchestrated violence, but they did something arguably more insidious. They proved that a sophisticated, intellectually coherent belief system could be just as psychologically destructive as crude propaganda. They showed how charisma, theology, and community could combine to trap intelligent people in delusion. The real danger of groups like The Process wasn't that they were obviously insane. It was that they weren't. They were coherent, they were attractive. They offered answers to questions people were genuinely asking, and they did it with enough intellectual sophistication that dismissing them felt like dismissing legitimate spirituality. That's what makes them worth studying, not as a curiosity, as a warning. The Process Church formally dissolved in the early 2000s, but their ideology persists in fragments across the occult underground. You can find echoes of their theology in contemporary occult communities. You can see their influence in how modern spiritual groups position themselves as interpreters of hidden truths. The machinery they built is still running somewhere. The Process Church's story isn't a simple morality tale. It's a lesson in how belief operates, how it spreads, how intelligent, well-meaning people can become trapped in systems that feel liberating but function as prisons. They weren't monsters, they were true believers, and that in some ways makes their story more unsettling than any straightforward tale of evil. Subscribe so you don't miss the next investigation into the cults, conspiracies, and belief systems that shaped modern history.